A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hello, Herman and Corin. As you know, I've been in Israel for many years now, and it's unfortunate that life here is a continual busy. There's always something going on. Sadly, at the moment, some of the busyness comes from running back and forth to shelters, but even at the best of times, as an immigrant in this part of the world, there's just so much to take care of, and I haven't had anywhere near as much time as I would like to make a deliberate daily effort to improve my modern Hebrew. I didn't grow up in a Jewish community in Ireland, and I think where my Hebrew falls down, besides in lack of daily conversation, although it's very related to your confidence, I've discovered. If you're confident, it's kind of a virtuous and a vicious cycle. If you're confident in having a baseline, you're more likely to talk, you've more linguistic experiences, you make friends, and then there becomes a critical mass where you don't need to actually deliberately learn a language anymore because you're surrounded by it. So that's kind of my goal, is to kickstart myself to get to that point of the evolution. And I think that where I struggle at the moment is vocabulary and just sometimes not knowing how to form a specific case. I really hate, I used to speak Spanish quite well through basically watching as much Spanish news as I could, listening to music and translating lyrics. And then when I went to Spain for a summer, I had a decent amount of confidence, and I'd love to kind of replicate that process with Hebrew. But of course, we're in the era of AI, and there's a lot more tools than were available even a few years ago. What I was thinking today, I was going to call up a store, and I'm looking for, very exciting, an 18650 battery charger. And I was trying to remember the word for a charger and how I can ask this question, which is what I do sometimes when I'm, going to call someone for a tech part. And I was thinking it would be great. I would love to just speak to an app, say a few things, and have it, read back to me the translated version. Now, I've seen that Google Translate have been adding features along these lines, and I was digging through it, but I didn't really find exactly what I was looking for. There is a cool feature for exchanging sentences. I recall we once took a taxi in Turkey, and do you remember this, Hannah? Hannah remembers it. I was using Google Translate, and it was really funny, and we were just like
using Google Translate.
Yeah, we were just handing a phone back and forth, and it actually worked. Like, the taxi guy was saying something in Turkish, he'd hit text to speech. So Google Translate have actually kind of elevated that kind of funny but effective way of being an interpreter to an art form. They have a nice feature for this, but it's not quite the same thing as what I'm looking for. The other thing that really works well with language learning, as we've talked about before, the importance of spaced repetition, that when you learn something, especially vocab, you want to periodically review it. Hebrew is a particularly important language for getting speech when you're translating, because of the fact that modern Hebrew isn't vowelized. So especially if you're a language learner, you need to know the correct vowelization, and Hebrew can be written with vowels as it originally was, but an easier way, I think, is for language learners at least, is just to play a TTS that has the inferred vowelization, and then you can save that to a memory list and review it. That's my spec, Herman and Corin. I'd love to have something primarily on my phone, which is where I'd be using it most of the time. But I always love to have things accessible on the cloud. Because my success in Israel depends on language, this is definitely something I'd be happy to pay a reasonable subscription for, or use a tool if there were a free one available. But I'd really like to get something good and fit for purpose for this. Can you recommend any apps for those trying to learn languages this way? To summarize, I want an app that can translate from English to Hebrew or other languages, I guess. And I will say something. It will read it back to me after a pause, show me the translation, and I can hear it, and then save it to a list to review later. Herman and Corin, what do you recommend?
I was looking at some language learning data the other day, and it is pretty wild how much the landscape has shifted just in the last year or so. People are moving away from these massive generic platforms that try to teach you every language from Spanish to Swahili, using the same cookie-cutter interface. Today's prompt from Daniel is about finding something much more specialized. He is looking for Hebrew learning tools that can handle a very specific workflow, speaking a phrase in English, getting a high-quality Hebrew translation back with full vocalization, and then immediately piping that into a spaced repetition system for long-term review.
It is a sophisticated request, but it makes perfect sense when you consider where the technology is in March 2026. We have reached this point where general-purpose translation is basically a solved problem for major European languages. But Semitic languages like Hebrew still present these unique technical hurdles that require a specialized stack. Daniel is essentially asking for a closed-loop system where the input is voice and the output is a durable memory anchor. Most people do not realize that the global language learning market has surged past $100 billion recently, and more than half of that growth is driven by these AI-integrated niche platforms.
The friction usually starts right at the input phase. If you're using a standard speech-to-text engine, you are often dealing with models that were trained primarily on English and then fine-tuned for other languages as an afterthought. For Hebrew, that usually results in what I call the robotic literalism problem. But before we even get to the translation, there is the orthography. Hebrew is an abjad, which means the writing system primarily uses consonants. The vowels are often invisible to the native reader.
And that is the first major wall Daniel is going to hit. When you speak English into a standard translator, it might give you the Hebrew letters, but for a learner, those letters are a puzzle without the Niqqud, the system of dots and dashes that represent vowels. If you do not have those, you are just guessing at the pronunciation. It is like trying to read English if we removed every vowel. The cat sat on the mat becomes the HCT est in the MT. You can guess it if you know the language, but if you are learning, you are lost.
That brings us to the technical challenge of mapping English phonemes to Hebrew orthography with Niqqud. Why is it so difficult for a standard AI to translate a spoken English phrase into Hebrew that actually sounds like something a person in Tel Aviv would say, while also providing those crucial vowel points?
The fundamental challenge is morphological and contextual. Most modern speech-to-text engines, like the standard versions of Whisper or Google Cloud, are designed to output clean, modern Hebrew, which means they strip away those vowel points entirely because they are rarely used in newspapers or on social media. If you are a fluent speaker, you do not need them. But if you are a learner like Daniel, those missing vowels are the difference between knowing how to pronounce a word and just staring at a string of consonants. Furthermore, Hebrew is intensely gender sensitive. The verb forms and adjectives change based on the gender of the speaker and the person being addressed. A general-purpose model often defaults to the masculine form, which makes the learner sound like a program script rather than a human being.
Right? And if you are trying to build a personal curriculum based on your own speech, you do not want to be memorizing incorrect gender conjugations. That just builds bad habits that are incredibly hard to break later. I know you have been digging into the latest benchmarks for these Hebrew-specific models. How does something like the HeBERT model compare to a general giant like GPT-4o Mini when it comes to generating that vocalized text Daniel is looking for?
It is a fascinating comparison. As of March 2026, HeBERT remains the state-of-the-art for specialized Hebrew natural language processing. While the massive general models like GPT-4o Mini are impressive and have massive reasoning capabilities, they often struggle with the Niqqud problem because their training data is overwhelmingly comprised of unvocalized modern web text. HeBERT, and some of the newer specialized layers built on top of it, are trained specifically to understand the morphological structure of Hebrew. When you ask a specialized tool for translation, it is not just predicting the next token, it is performing a morphological analysis to ensure the Niqqud aligns with the intended grammatical role of the word.
Let's talk about the Whisper API versus Google Cloud Speech-to-Text for Hebrew specifically. If Daniel is speaking English, the translation engine has to be top tier. But if he ever wants to speak Hebrew back to the app to check his own pronunciation, the dialect accuracy matters.
Whisper has made huge strides, but in our latest tests for March 2026, Google Cloud still has a slight edge in recognizing the specific guttural shifts in modern Israeli Hebrew, the way the ayin and het are pronounced in Tel Aviv versus more formal settings. However, Whisper is much better at handling the code switching, where a learner might mix English and Hebrew in the same sentence. The real technical magic Daniel needs, though, is a vector database integration.
Explain that for the non-engineers. How do vector databases enable this Save to SRS feature?
Think of a vector database as a way to index the meaning of a phrase rather than just the words. When Daniel saves a phrase like, "Where is the nearest pharmacy?" the system creates a semantic embedding, a mathematical representation of that intent. This allows the spaced repetition system to not just show him that exact card, but to group it with similar concepts. It ensures that the memory loop is reinforced by context. If he learns 5 different ways to ask for directions, the vector database helps the SRS algorithm realize they are related, which speeds up the neural encoding process.
So, if we're looking at the specific apps Daniel mentioned, there is this one called Do It in Hebrew that seems to be the heavy hitter for this exact workflow. I was looking at their March 2026 update, and they seem to have leaned hard into the voice-to-voice side of things.
They really have. Do It in Hebrew is currently one of the top recommendations because it solves the vocalization gap directly. When you speak an English phrase into it, the translation it provides includes the correct Niqqud by default. That is a massive technical win for a learner. They have integrated a phonetic keyboard and over 1,500 verb conjugation tables. But the real feature Daniel is after is the ability to save those translations. In their latest version, you can hear the native level pronunciation and then instantly hit a favorite button to save it to a list.
But saving it to a list is only half the battle. A list is just a digital graveyard where information goes to be forgotten, unless there is a mechanism to bring it back to your attention. This brings us to the second part of the prompt, the Space Repetition System, or SRS. Herman, I know you have some thoughts on why apps like Reverso Context are popular for this, even if their raw translation accuracy is not always at the top of the charts.
Reverso is a great example of a tool that prioritizes the memory loop over the translation peak. Their Hebrew accuracy is often rated around 5.5 out of 10 because they still struggle with those gender handling nuances I mentioned earlier. However, their integration with SRS is seamless. It automatically takes your search history and your favorites list and generates flashcards and quizzes. It uses an algorithm to determine exactly when you are about to forget a phrase and then surfaces it for review. For a lot of learners, a slightly imperfect translation that you actually remember is more valuable than a perfect translation that you forget 5 minutes after you hear it.
That is a fair point, but I think Daniel, with his background in technology and automation, might want something a bit more precise. If he is looking for the gold standard of accuracy, he should probably be looking at Baba. I was reading a review from earlier this month that gave it a 9.8 out of 10 for Hebrew translation. It is apparently the only major app that handles all 7 Hebrew gender contexts natively.
Baba is an incredible piece of engineering. It focuses on what they call Tel Aviv-style phrasing. Instead of giving you a stiff, formal translation that you might find in a textbook from the 1950s, it gives you the living language. The technical reason for its success is that it uses a specialized translation endpoint that focuses on semantic intent rather than word-for-word replacement. The downside, and this is where Daniel might find a hurdle, is that Baba does not have a native high-end SRS built into it yet. It is a world-class translator, but it is not a full-featured study suite.
Now that we have looked at the input side, let's talk about the rendering nightmare of RTL text. This is where things get really messy for anyone who has ever tried to build their own study cards.
You're talking about the BiDi battle. BiDi stands for bidirectional text. When you mix a left-to-right language like English with a right-to-left language like Hebrew, most software frameworks just give up. You end up with punctuation on the wrong side of the line, or the Hebrew words appearing in the wrong order relative to the English ones. Even in 2026, many mobile user interfaces struggle with the Unicode BiDi algorithm, or UBA.
I remember we talked about this back in episode 775. It is one of those invisible technical debts of the internet. Most of the web was built by people who speak left to right languages, so right to left support often feels like an afterthought. If Daniel tries to copy a vocalized Hebrew phrase from a translator into a standard flashcard app, there is a high probability that the formatting will break, making the card nearly impossible to read.
It is a nightmare for SRS. Imagine your flashcard says, the word for apple is, and then the Hebrew word tapwach appears to the left of the English sentence instead of the right, and the question mark is floating in the middle of the word. This is why proprietary ecosystems like Duolingo or Memrise are so popular. They control the rendering environment. But they lack the flexibility Daniel wants. If he wants to use Anki, he has to deal with the UBA directly.
Speaking of Memrise, how does it compare to something like Closemaster for Hebrew? I know Closemaster has a different philosophy on context.
Closemaster is significantly better for the intermediate plateau Daniel might be facing. While Memrise focuses on isolated vocabulary, Closemaster uses close tests sentences with a missing word. For Hebrew, this is vital because the meaning of a word often changes based on the prepositions attached to it. Closemaster handles the RTL rendering much better than the older versions of Memrise, and it allows for much more rapid-fire review of how words actually function in the wild.
Pealim is another one we have to mention. I know they just had a big update on March 9th.
Pealim is an essential tool. It is developed by Valeria Skrobova, and the version 0.12.4 that just came out improved their dictionary and contextual sections significantly. Pealim is primarily a database of verbs and nouns, but it is famous for its clean rendering and full audio vocalization. While it is not a speech-to-text translator, it is the place you go to verify that the translation you got from an AI is actually grammatically sound. You can save any of their 9,000 plus words to a favorites list, and the rendering is always perfect because they have spent years perfecting their Hebrew first UI.
So, if I am Daniel and I want to build this perfect workflow today, I am probably looking at a best-of-breed approach. Herman, if you were going to architect a custom solution for this using today's tech, how would you do it?
I would go for a just-in-time learning stack. I would use the Microsoft Azure Hebrew English Translation API as the backend. As of late March 2026, Azure currently offers better support for Niqqud and morphological accuracy than most standard consumer APIs, including Google's basic Translate API. I would set up a simple voice trigger, maybe a button on a smartwatch or a phone using an iOS shortcut that records the English phrase, sends it to the Azure endpoint, and returns the vocalized Hebrew.
And then how do you get it into the SRS without manual data entry?
That is where Zapier or Make.com's temptation. You can set up a webhook where the translated text and the audio file are automatically pushed into an Anki deck via the Anki Connect API. Anki is the old reliable of the SRS world. It is not always the prettiest, but its API is robust. By using the Anki API, Daniel could programmatically create cards that are pre-formatted with CSS to handle the BiDi rendering issues. He could have the English on the front and the vocalized Hebrew with an audio play button on the back.
This interaction-first approach is so much more effective than following a preset curriculum. It is the difference between learning how to say, the apple is on the table, and learning how to say, I need to pick up Ezra from daycare at 4 o'clock. One is a textbook exercise, the other is a vital piece of information for your life.
There is a common misconception that more data, like just listening to Hebrew podcasts all day, is the best way to achieve fluency. But for a language as structurally different as Hebrew is from English, targeted data via SRS is much more efficient. You need those high-frequency personal phrases to form the hooks in your brain that the rest of the language can hang on to.
We should also address the misconception that standard speech-to-text apps provide correct Hebrew just because they provide readable Hebrew. If you are using an app that doesn't provide Niqqud, you are only learning half the language. You are learning how to recognize the shape of a word, but not how to speak it.
That is a huge trap. Many learners think they are making progress because they can recognize the Hebrew word for bread on a screen, but because they never learned the vocalization, they cannot use it in a conversation. That is why Daniel's request for correct vocalization is so technically insightful. He knows that without the vowels, the memory anchor is incomplete.
To summarize for Daniel, if he wants an off-the-shelf solution, do it in Hebrew is probably his best bet for the specific voice to vocalized text requirement. If he wants the best translation accuracy for complex sentences, he should keep Baba on his home screen for quick checks. And for the best SRS loop that handles context, Closemaster is the winner.
And for the truly high-level approach, the Pealim dictionary is his best friend for verifying morphology. But if he really wants to automate the whole thing, the Azure to Anki pipeline via Zapier is the pro move. It removes the friction of data entry and lets him focus entirely on the interaction.
It is wild to think about how much technical infrastructure is required just to make a simple language app feel natural. Between the BiD rendering, the Niqqud injection, the gender-aware translation, and the SRS scheduling, it is a massive engineering challenge. Most people just see a button and a text box, but there is this whole world of vector databases and semantic embeddings working behind the scenes.
What I find genuinely exciting is that we are finally seeing these tools move beyond the Indo-European bias. For decades, if you were learning a language that did not use the Latin alphabet, you were essentially a second-class citizen in the software world. Now, with the rise of specialized NLP models like HeBERT and better global standards for RTL text, the gap is closing. Daniel is at the forefront of this, using these tools not just to learn, but to integrate a new language into his daily life in Jerusalem.
It makes me wonder if we are approaching a point where the concept of a native speaker starts to blur. If everyone has a high-fidelity, zero-latency translator in their ear that also functions as a perfect memory coach, the barrier to entry for complex languages like Hebrew starts to melt away.
It is a profound shift. We might be the last generation that has to struggle to learn a language. Future generations might just install the necessary linguistic frameworks through these continuous interaction loops. But for now, the struggle is part of the process, and having the right tools makes that struggle a lot more productive.
Well, I think we have given Daniel plenty to chew on. From the Baba accuracy to the Pealim database and the custom Anki stack, there is a clear path forward for his Hebrew mastery. It is all about building that loop capture, translate, vocalize, and repeat.
It is the ultimate productivity hack for the brain. I am looking forward to seeing how these tools evolve even further by the end of the year. The pace of development in the Hebrew ed tech space right now is just staggering.
Hopefully Daniel can find a few minutes between work and family life to actually use them. If he manages to automate the whole process, he might even have time for a nap. A sloth can dream, right?
A sloth can certainly dream, and a donkey can keep reading the research papers to make sure those dreams are grounded in data.
That is the perfect division of labor. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the specialized models we talked about today.
If you found this dive into Hebrew learning tech useful, we would love it if you could leave a quick review on your podcast app. It really helps other curious minds find the show.
You can find our full archive, including those deep dives into BiDi text and modern Hebrew engineering, at myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops.
This has been My Weird Props. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Korn. We will catch you in the next one.
Goodbye.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow to